the moment that everyone feared has arrived. I'm sitting alone in front of the webcam, no fellow players to regulate me. Who knows what will happen? I wanted to record a short video discussing the prep that went into our first dungeon for Planetary, Convulsionary, Evolutionary D&D 4E. Um, and I think that this might be surprising, either to people who believe the dungeon master should have every eventuality prepared for, every detail of the dungeon set in stone, uh, or those who think the dungeon master should be improvising whatever's in the dungeon and kind of creating the dungeon one room ahead of the players in response to what they're asking for, what they're doing. We're talking about a pretty different process from either of those. I did want to say, when I first sat down to design this dungeon, the first environment for this game, I was very overwhelmed by content. If you've seen the backdrop document that I shared with Sam and David before we started playing, it is very dense. There's a lot of content. I also have a sketchy but rather large hand drawn map of the glacier and the surrounding environments where Aldred and Shaloub find themselves. And I really, for a couple of days, found myself stuck in this place of wondering, do I want to start by playing cold and, you know, play some of the Githzerai politics and day to day life? Do I want to start, really hot in the middle of some kind of crisis situation? Um, just a lot of options, very overwhelmed with content, overwhelmed with possibilities. For a while, I was debating one of two ways. So maybe starting cold, playing a bit of the Githzerai day to day life, but having a dungeon prepped that the players would then go to, or having 3 or 4 locations prepped and then dropping Aldred and Shaloub in media res and seeing which path they would take to which environment. But I quickly kind of discarded these ideas. Like I was holding on to them because I knew I had to have something right. So it was kind of a desperation thing. I was holding on to these ideas, but I knew that first one, that just always sucks, right? When you have to like play through some obligatory scenes, you interact with some NPCs, you get to play your characters in a kind of theatrical way, but we know that no matter what happens in these scenes, like we're on our way to the dungeon, right? So there's just like can we just skip over that shit and get to the actual play, right, where we don't know what's going to happen? So I knew that wasn't the way I wanted to go. And then frankly, the idea of prepping like 3 or 4 good dungeons in a week, or honestly even 2, was far too much work. I don't have enough time, and frankly, I don't have the creative resources to come up with like multiple compelling, interesting, frightening environments to throw the PCs into. So both of these, I was stuck between them, but I knew neither of them was really going to work. And I actually returned to a post at Adept Play, which is by Sean Hillman, about the process of designing a dungeon. And Sean provides a lot of great insight in that post, and the comments and the conversation in the comments also bring up a lot of great material. And the main thing that I took away from that post, kind of, giving me a new starting point, was that we're playing Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition to get to the dungeons, right? That's what we're here for. We're here for the monsters. We're here for the fights. We're here for the dramatic, melodramatic conflicts. So let's just like stop worrying about all this backdrop shit. Like, we need one dungeon that these 2 characters can go into. Who cares if this leads into some grand campaign. Let's have something good now that we can play with, and we're going to see where it goes. So that was really helpful. I just focused in. I cast my eyes across my hand drawn map. The snake rib herb popped out of me, this frozen dragonborn city. So I started imagining, what is that place like? Who's there? I've also been recently reading Fafford and the Grey Mouser stories. And if you have not read The Howling Tower by Fritz Leiber, you really should. It's a wonderful story. And the notion of this haunted, mysterious tower exerting some kind of luring effect on the environment around it really has been sticking with me. So, I had the skyscrapers from the snake rib herb. I had the Howling Tower, the short story, and it all kind of mixed together, right? And I've suddenly, had the main character of my dungeon, this Dragonborn, who has been frozen for decades and decades, has just thawed, and really wondering when this character wakes up and emerges, sees the ruins of everything that she's known. What is she going to do, especially because she has these, immense magical necromantic resources? What's that character going to do? So I started there and then started weaving that dungeon around her. And if I do say so myself, I think it turned out pretty well. Now, when it came to actually building the dungeon, again, some comments in that Adept Play thread were very helpful. One of them said something along the lines of, why have 12 rooms in your dungeon if there are only two good ones? Just give me the two good rooms. So I knew that this was going to be pretty small. So I had just a handful of rooms, all of them plucked from Dyson Logos. I had the top of the tower where the pillar or the siren and the bat were. Uh, I had in the basement of the tower, a kind of indeterminate environment space that you would move through that was basically just, this labyrinthine basement that you would find in any large structure, right? So the basement, the sub basement, the sub basement. That wasn't really detailed, but I knew that to get from one place in the tower to the other, you might have to traverse this kind of more abstract space. And, if necessary, I could have easily drawn a hallway on a grid, right? So if combat did happen there, that would be easy to manage. But I figured it's probably fine just to have that as indeterminate space that we move through to get other spaces. Uh, I also had the living quarters where my dragonborn dwelt. I was sort of softly imagining maybe some history rolls, some perception rolls as the players, rifled through this area, tried to discover what was going on. Uh, I had a room where which was really the center of my Dragonborn's magical power. There were quite a few enemies in that room. And then past that room was her lab, where she and some other entities were staying and working. Um, and within each of these rooms, I knew who was there or what was there, what they were doing, depending on the time of day. I kind of had an idea of the routine, um, and that was really it. Couple of locations, all of them mapped out in case combat occurred, and then 6 or 7 monster sheets from the monster manual. That is all I had going into this, and then of course all of the backdrop, all of the backstory for this for the Dragonborn character, right? Knowing the effects that she's having on the environment around her. So really not a lot of content. Uh, and I mention in the first video, I think, that I was kind of imagining this dungeon as like playing with the bumpers up, like we're at the bowling alley, we put the bumpers up. Um, and, you know, Pretty simple choice at the beginning. The characters could go up toward the tower where the cool shiny light was. They could go down into the depths. And then, once they got into the depths, they'd hit the living quarters, the magical room, and then the lab. So, very kind of simple linear dungeon design here. But one thing that surprised me, probably shouldn't have, but it did, is that once we got into play and the characters started moving, not just Aldred and Shalhoub, but the characters under my control, once they started moving and doing things, things actually became much more dynamic. It was not just a linear trek through the dungeon. And in fact, all of the action that occurred in that one room at the top of the tower, with some scenes outside. So this small dungeon actually turned out to be even smaller in practice. In spite of that, we had information going from the top of the tower down to the lab. We had characters coming from the lab up to the top of the tower, a lot of movement and dynamism, even in this apparently very linear space of the dungeon. And the reason for that really comes down to once information starts moving, once characters start acting, it becomes very uncontrollable, right? Things begin to occur, events emerge out of those actions that no one can predict. And I was quite pleased to actually have a nice case study for that. This looks like the most linear, kind of boring dungeon possible. Turns out in play, it was actually quite dynamic and more complex than I was expecting. Um, so overall, very pleased with how this dungeon turned out. Also, quite happy with the amount of work it took to build. Um, Once I kind of got over that initial stage, it came together very quickly. It didn't feel like I was having to do a ton of homework to get this done. So definitely something I feel like I could do on a weekly basis, and that this is creatively sustainable over multiple sessions, multiple weeks or months of play. The only other thing I'll say is that something we're still feeling out in the game is how the characters move from one dungeon to another within the larger situation. Um, and as far as I can tell, in the situation that the characters are in, without NPCs who show up in session after session, who Aldred and Shalhoub are in contact with, in the absence of all that stuff, really the only thing that's going to create continuity between the dungeons are major quests. Those are really the only thing I can see creating the continuity that would get us from one dungeon to another. Because just because we've gotten one dungeon out of the way, some of those problems I discussed at the beginning are still there. Like, I don't want to go to town and play some scenes and then kind of move everybody to the next dungeon from there, right? That's not very compelling play to me. It might have cool characterization, doesn't sound very exciting. Um, and interestingly enough, there was the possibility of a major quest from Aldred that might have served as that connective tissue. Sam had declared a quest that Aldred wanted to find another pillar or another siren technology that he could use to help his people. And of course, delve weird mystical depths, I'm sure. Uh, However, after play, when we were kind of debriefing a little bit, Sam expressed that Aldred really feels uh, as though everything about this dungeon was cursed. He didn't want to delve deeper into the basement. He didn't want to follow up on this quest. So again, we're kind of left without a new vector that they're moving toward. Uh, Shalhoub has the minor quest to get the meat back to the settlement, but again, I don't, I'm not terribly interested in the logistics of getting that back, so not enough to really create a new now, in my opinion. So, with the lack of a major quest, The characters are really kind of at the mercy of my whims again, which I don't think is a bad thing. I don't think it's controlling. I think it's perfectly functional. But, if they leave this dungeon and continue doing what they're doing, which is going out onto the ice, hunting animals, going on cool adventures, then that's going to be the status quo, right? Them wandering around the glacier, having adventures, and then the next dungeon is going to be them encountering something, or something encountering them within that context. But not something that they are searching for specifically. Because again, we don't have that vector from the game. So I think at the end of the day, what we're looking at least for the next dungeon, is a bit like a Fafford and the Grey Mouser story, right? There's going to be some amount of time between the end of this story and the beginning of the next one, but they're really going to be two short stories, right? That we're not creating a novel right now, and we'll just kind of have to hold off and see if any bigger narrative concerns or any bigger character vectors appear at this next dungeon that would begin to create more continuity. Or, I'm quite happy with having, 4 or 5 wonderful, trippy short stories starring Aldred and Shaloub, where the continuity is their relationship, their characters, seeing how they change, but not necessarily seeing them go through some kind of grand arc. So, just a few thoughts on what went into the dungeon, and then also some thoughts on how we're getting from one dungeon to the next one right now. And time will tell. I'm really curious to see in a couple of weeks after this dungeon if things are changing at all, or if we're going to continue with this kind of anthology style of storytelling.